you very much, Marcia, for this wonderful introduction. It has been such a pleasure to meet you and also the other people here. And before I get started, I would like to thank the organizers, Visa, you, and also I've been emailing with Nina, who has been very helpful in my queries, and everybody else who's been present. And so when I said yes to this invitation, to the invitation for this conference, I actually thought it would be an animal law conference. So it would be about the legal agency of non-human animals. But then when I looked better, I saw that it was about legal agency generally. And that's great. I've learned a lot from everyone. And I also find it really interesting and hopeful that many of us are working on the same questions in different fields. And I think that we do this from different perspectives and different angles, but it's been very helpful for me to be here and to learn from all of you. And I'm really excited to be able to tell you a little bit about my work. And when I say my work, this immediately turns me to the question of positionality, as Anna laid out in her keynote so wonderfully. What I always like to do before I start is credit the non-human beings with whom I developed these ideas. So my personal thinking partners, but also the others that I encountered during my research. On the photograph here you see Kuzi, and Kuzi lives with her sister Kaya in Brokers Creek. That's a very small town in Australia. They were born in a lab, and they are now living in an intentional multi-species community. Marcia already briefly mentioned that I'm part of an animal art collective, a multi-species art collective, and they're great artists. In fact, they are such great artists and landscapers that they have their own house within the community, because otherwise they would landscape the whole terrain into ways that are not so beneficial for other beings. But I won't be able to show you their work because it's not the topic of today, but I do want to introduce her. I'm also wearing my animal pants with some of the faces of the of my colleagues like Doris and Puti and Pika, who were all, and Oli, who was a great thought partner of me, so that they are here with me a little bit. Because when I'm speaking about positionality, I immediately want to recognize that we are human animals here in this room, and we are speaking in human language. And we are, through speaking in human language, we are actually immediately making a movement that's not neutral, but involves a lot of power relations, especially because we are speaking about others. We've been speaking about natural entities, non-human animals, disabled humans in different settings, children, but it's a quite select group of us that have been discussing this. So I want to acknowledge that and also acknowledge my own role in that system and my commitment to changing it where we can. And this is also the topic of my talk today, so I want to go further than simply stating that we need to recognize the agency of non-human animals in law. I want to argue that we should co-shape a new understanding of perhaps multi-species law or animal law, since we are all animals, together with non-human animals. But before I get to that, I will need to tell you some other things so that it makes more sense for you. So, do animals speak? Do non-human animals speak? In the Western philosophical tradition, I'm speaking here as a philosopher, so not as an expert on law. The answer has been no, mostly. And we already find this in the work of the ancient Greek philosophers. I often refer to the work of Aristotle in this regard, who wrote that humans are the only political animals. And with that, he he actually drew 3 borders between all humans and all other animals around language and around the political community. And I'm mentioning this example because I immediately want to say something about the fact that the question of language is always political. We see that in other ways in Aristotle's work as well, and as we all know is that he did not refer to all humans. It was a very select group of free males that were political animals in this regard. But forget Aristotle, let's go to the prairie dogs. Prairie dogs are a species of ground squirrels. You can see them in the picture. And they communicate by making sounds that sound a bit like guinea pig sounds. So like, and with these sounds, that for us sound like, they communicate quite complex messages to one another. They, for example, have a very complex system of alarm calls. So prairie dogs live in tunnels underneath the ground, and they always need to come out of their tunnel system to eat. So they're a very easy prey for predators. Predators only have to wait near the edges of the tunnels, and then the prairie dogs will come out and they can eat them. So the prairie dogs need to tell each other if a predator approaches, but also if they come from the sky or from the land, because this is necessary for knowing where you are going to go as a prairie dog. But they do not stop there. So when a human being enters their habitat, they tell each other, look, there's a human approaching. They tell each other if this is a familiar human or a new human. They tell each other about the speed with which they're approaching, their height, the color of their hair, the color of their t-shirt, whether or not they are carrying something like an umbrella or a gun. If someone entered their territory once shooting a gun, they will tell each other the next time they see this human, watch out, that's the human who was shooting the gun last time. They do not just describe humans in detail, they do the same thing with coyotes. They also name the coyotes that are hunting them, so they have specific sounds referring to them. With their little squeaking sounds, they can make new words. So they, for example, made a new word for oval object coming from the sky in a research where an oval object was coming from the sky, unknown oval object coming from the sky, they said. And their language has a grammar. So the meaning of a sentence changes when the different elements when the position of the different sounds changes as well. This is only one tiny aspect of their language. So these are only the alarm calls. They also have a form of social chatter that we don't know a lot about. And they do the jump yip, which is like a wave. And they do this, for example, when a snake leaves their territory. So it's seen to be an expression of joy. So they jump and say yip. So it's like yip. And small ones also need to learn this and fall over. There are videos of this on YouTube, which is problematic in itself for reasons of privacy. But that aside, the great thing about these, about prairie dog language is not that it's so complex, because we know that the same is true for a lot of languages of other non-human animals. What is interesting is that it has been studied in so much detail. So the prairie dog language was studied by Kon Slobodchikov, a biologist, Russian-American biologist, who devoted decades to studying this language, and who still feels like he only scratched the surface of what they are saying to each other. For most animal species, we know very little. But what we know already challenges the idea that humans have language and other animals don't. So many of the aspects that are seen as unique for human language, and bear in mind that language says something about the inner lives of others and their social lives, many of the aspects that we saw as unique for humans are also found in the languages of other animals. Think of names. Humans think that humans are the only beings who name others. But dolphins have names. They are called signature whistles. So when a dolphin meets a new group, they introduce themselves, and other dolphins will then refer to that dolphin by their name. Parrots have names. Parrots can also be bilingual, and what I like a lot is that parrots are one of the only species that sort of hacked the human language for their own purposes. So there are parrots in Australia that escaped and then taught their wild species, members of their species, English. So they are they've introduced English into their species-specific context. But I was speaking about names. Elephants have names. Bats have names. Bats apparently also like to gossip. They argue a lot, and when the bat that they were arguing with flies away, you can hear the other bats speaking about this bat for a very long time. Animals also sometimes name humans. There is anecdotal evidence that chickens name the humans with whom they live. So if there are multiple humans, they refer to them with a specific sound to discuss that human amongst each other. Oh, look, there's that person coming again. Chickens also already speak to their children when they are inside the egg, and young chicks are much better at mathematics than human babies, but that aside. And there are not only the example of the chickens already shows that there are not only very complex species-specific languages, but that there are also a lot of languages or language games between humans and animals of other species. There's a lot of research about understanding between humans and dogs. So when dogs see human faces on photographs, they will interpret their mood correctly. The other way around, when humans hear a dog bark on tape, they will judge the meaning of the bark correctly, even when they are not living with dogs. There are many, many studies of other domesticated animals. Sheep, for example, still recognize the faces of humans 7 years after they met them. Humans like to show other animals photographs. There are many studies with that. There are also studies showing horses photographs, and then when they meet the human later, they anticipate on whether or not on the mood of that person. So when they saw an angry photograph, a photograph of an angry face, they will be more cautious when they see that human than when they see a smiling photograph. They will be more eager to meet that being. And all of these studies challenge the exceptionalism of human language. I mentioned names, but grammar is one of these other things that keep showing up. The languages of many birds, for example, have grammars, and what's also important to recognize is that languages of other animals do not just include sounds, but also scent, bodily movements, and even color. I will say a bit more about color later. And this new research has changed how we think about other animals in philosophy and the humanities more broadly. It forces us to rethink the image of the human and human capacities, and it also forces us to rethink our ethical and political relations with other beings. These relations, of course, already exist, even when humans do not recognize them. I will give a couple of more examples of political agency later on. But I like the story of the bin opening cockatoos in Sydney. So the thing is that the cockatoos are opening the bins to eat from them, and then humans are devising new ways of closing them. And then the cockatoos find out how to open them again. So they're like constantly doing this, and different groups of cockatoos have their own strategies for opening the bins. So it's really an innovation arms race with humans. And what's interesting is not just that they do it, but also that these kinds of articles are written about it. Because for a very long time, the capacities of non-human animals were measured to a human standard. You see that very clearly in the study of animal language, where for a very long time the linguistic capacities of other animals were studied based on how well they could speak human language. But for many other species, this is of course quite difficult, for example, because they lack the sensory or the physical abilities to do this. And what we now see is that all kinds of concepts, language, culture, cognition, emotion, are understood in species-specific ways. This research is not just limited to mammals and birds. I wanted to show you this example as well of bumblebees who are playing with balls. And I mean, there's a lot to be said about the problematic aspects of studying animals in laboratories and so on. But it's interesting that researchers are now considering bumblebees in different ways and investigating the fact that they play. So this movement that I mentioned, from taking the human as a blueprint for studying other animals, has had consequences for how philosophy and philosophers have understood and framed agency. There's a paper by Jeff Sebo in which he argues for a form of perceptual agency, in which he coins the term propositional agency. And propositional agency is the type of agency that many of us have argued against in the past days. A highly rationalistic form of agency based on human cognitive capacities that excludes many beings, also many human beings, and that has led to an impoverished view of the beings that were excluded, and also those who were included, I think. And one of the, some of the things that have been mentioned against this view of propositional agency, in which, for example, the capacity for second-order thought is seen to be necessary for exercising agency, or to plan ahead in human-specific ways. Some of the counter-arguments against that is that differences are of degree and not kind. That humans often act habitually, that propositional agency is based on specific human forms of reasoning, and these are not just, and here human does not refer to the biological category human, but to the ideological category of the human, while other beings obviously have their own forms of reasoning, agency, and so on. Another point that has been discussed a lot here is that relations co-determine our scope for agency in very fundamental ways. Most animal philosophers are on board with variations of this argument, and many other philosophers as well, I think, that there's a need to rethink highly rationalistic forms of agency, to see agency as more relational, and also to understand that difference is different but not less. The last bullet point on this slide is a little bit more contested, and that regards political agency. Before I turn to that, I want to introduce some people to you. The first person is Ken Allen, aka the Hairy Houdini. Ken is a orangutan who lived in a zoo and was famous for his ways of escaping his prison. Jason Rebel, who is a historian who wrote a lot about non-human animal resistance, including the wonderful book Fear of the Animal Planet, for those who are interested in animal resistance, wrote that Ken Allen was already interested in escaping when he was just a very young child. He was all the time trying to get the vault open, and he wasn't satisfied with staying in the space that was designated for him. He also worked together with the other orangutans that he was imprisoned with, and they, the zoo couldn't figure out how they did it. So they hired spies, humans trying to be visitors. They also sometimes try to lure them back with back with women, orangutan women, and bananas, and but he didn't want to go back. He wanted his freedom. And what Rebel shows is that very often zoos and aquaria and other places where non-human animals are forced to perform for humans, they often want to frame these acts of protest as incidental, and they, for example, doubt the mental health of the beings involved. You see this in the acts of resistance of large sea mammals as well. I don't know if you've seen the documentary Blackfish about Tilikum and others. That also makes very clear what kind of discourse the aquaria want to propagate. But Rebel shows that no, these acts are structural, and you can find them across the whole spectrum. Sometimes animal political acts influence human political decision making. In the 1850s, humans wanted to introduce camels into the military in the US, but the camels wouldn't have it. So they spit at the soldiers, they bit them, the soldiers became very scared of the camels. And then the government said, no, it was just an experiment to try to get these camels into the government. But it wasn't an experiment. The camels made it into an experiment. Another example is Tyke. She was forced to work in a circus and abused for her whole life until one day in Hawaii, she killed her trainer, who had been abusive towards her and the other elephants in the circus, and also other animals. And then she made she ran for it. She injured a clown from the circus and also some bystanders. Unfortunately, she was shot and killed, but her acts did draw attention to problems with these circuses and had legal and political consequences. So human activists took up her acts as examples of what was wrong, and were able to make a change. And it's not just humans assisting other animals in these examples. Sometimes they also come to our help. A really nice example of this, I think, are the riot dogs, who join protesters in many different parts of the world in their protest. In this picture you can see Lukanikos, who was a very famous Greek riot dog. He died probably because of complications of breathing in tear gas. There's a nice documentary about him and other street dogs called Dogs of Democracy, about the dogs in Athens. But riot dogs also are found in other countries in the world, and assist human protesters. These are all quite, how should I say it, expressive and loud acts of protest. And I also want to honor the acts of protest that we don't see, such as those of animals held in laboratories. I've lived with and written about laboratory mice who have many acts of care and ways of resistance, but we don't see them resisting. I also want to point out the acts of resistance of work animals and animals in intensive farming, animals in slaughterhouses. They are not going to the slaughter passively. They will try to wriggle away. They will make sounds. They will say that they don't want this to happen. It's always there, even if humans ignore it. So how should we think about these acts? In recent years, let's say the past 15 years, if we begin with Zoopolis, a book by Sudan Kimlika, these questions are considered in political animal philosophy. For a very long time, animals are mostly considered in ethics, and ethical questions about non-human animals are questions like, can we eat them? Can we hold them captive? Can we hold them as companions? What are we allowed as humans? But the research I discussed, and there is much, much more, has challenged this sort of subject-object relationship in thinking, because obviously other animals also think about humans and make themselves known to humans. This raises a whole lot of other questions, like what kind of communities do they form with one another? What kind of communities do they want to form with humans? And in philosophy, this has led political philosophers to think about political frameworks to do justice to them, to understand relationships, and also to offer routes for reformulating these relationships. I should note that animal ethics has always also been a political project and a legal project as well, because animal ethicists have always been concerned with not just changing life for animals as on the individual level, but taking seriously also the institutional level, because otherwise the situation is of course never going to change. But what is new in this political turn is that philosophers are using explicitly political concepts to think through relationships, and this offers us a new toolbox to understand these relationships. For reasons of time, I won't go into the whole movement, but I want to point out that in political animal philosophy, there are two ways of thinking about political animal agency. In the first strand, philosophers argue that we should represent other animals in politics. For example, Alistair Cochrane argues for a cosmopolitan view of society based on sentience. So according to him, sentience is what matters, and other animals also count, but they should be represented by humans in more just societies. Robert Garner writes about deliberation. He argues that other animals should be also included in deliberation, or actually their interests should be included in deliberation. N.G. Pepper also takes a cosmopolitan view and argues that non-human animals should be represented. They have a right to be represented. But humans are the ones who are doing the representation. In another strand of political animal philosophy, where my work is located, and also the work of Sue Donaldson and Will Kimlicka, non-human animals are seen as agents with whom we have political relationships. Donaldson and Kimlicka have proposed a group differentiated view of political rights, in which they draw on insights from liberal democratic theory. Just for those who are not so familiar with the animal politics theory, they distinguish between domesticated animals, who should be seen as members of shared multi-species communities, and who also have a right to have a say about how these communities are formed, what kind of things we collectively do, and so on. Sovereign animal communities existing of wild animals who do not want any contact with humans, and liminal animals, those who live amongst us, like rats and crows, but who don't have really close relationships with humans and don't desire that, but still we need to share habitats and have some discussions about that. They've conceptualized the agency of these animals in quite different ways, and I think that they are correct to look at the social relationships. I think that this is one of the key ways in which Donaldson and Kimlicka have helped the field forward, is that they argue that it's when thinking about relationships with non-human animals, it's not just about individual interactions or about interactions on the species level, and this was very long the way in which humans thought about this, but they say social relationships matter too, and this is, I think, very obvious, because we have other rights with regard to farmed animals, and they have other we have other duties with regard to farmed animals, and they have other rights and duties than, for example, wild animals that we never see, or those who live deep in the sea, and so on. So again, it's a relational point, but it's specifically drawing on the literature of about human social groups to navigate and test out how this works. And one thing to keep in mind, which is actually also on, on the slide, is that it's never just a matter of putting animals into politics. I think this is very often a response that humans immediately have, right? Oh, now you want to put animals in politics. Oh, you want to give animals voice. And I always say, no, I don't give them voice. They already speak. We need to listen. But the idea is that we need to rethink the concepts that we're using either in relation to them or preferably with them. And this leads me back to the question of language, because who speaks is always a political question. Those of us doing feminist work, doing work with humans with disabilities, children, and so on, know this very well. It's also a very, it's one of the things that humans do when they colonize other countries, right? They say to the humans living there, your language is not as rational as our language, and we are now going to change the institution so that our language is the official language, and then humans often become ashamed. And what you see now around the world as part of the colonial practices is that humans are actually reclaiming their languages and doing that as a form of protest, but also recognition of the value of their own culture. And with non-human animals, there's something. It's the same mechanism, but it's done in a very fundamental way. So we do not just deny that they have anything useful to say in our societies, but we even say that they are not speaking at all. Which is something that I think most animals would find very strange, because how would they get by, right, if they're not constantly speaking with each other about everything? like I already said, there is of course a great variety in how other animals express themselves. And when you are thinking about animals and politics, this is something, to respect and not see as an obstacle, but rather as an invitation. I always like what Merleau-Ponty writes about understanding, because humans then say, oh, but we don't understand animals. I will say more about this in a second, but he says that understanding only happens when you are different, because when you are completely the same, you don't need understanding. There's only sameness. So this is good to keep in mind. So animals have been silenced. They have been excluded from what we think of as language, or as proper language, as political language. But there's also another relationship between politics and language. I began this talk by saying a little bit about Aristotle, connecting language to political agency, to the political community. And of course there are many non-linguistic political acts, but there is a democratic power in language, in being able to speak with each other. So when we are thinking about other animals and language, this is not just a moral claim, it's also a democratic claim. The fact that they have a perspective on life, a perspective on us, that they can frame within our communities should have democratic consequences. So animals speak, but humans do not listen. Just to tune on into this objection a little bit, that we cannot speak with other animals. Because sometimes I give this whole talk about non-human animals and language, and then at the end somebody says, yeah, but we can't understand what they're saying. So I thought, okay, maybe I should say something about this beforehand. This position I named species skepticism, and it's basically a speciesist variety of skepticism. So very often humans assume, and I'm not just speaking about philosophers, but also about the general audience, that we can get an idea of what other humans think because we share the same language. But the minds of other animals are black boxes. They remain a mystery to us. And this is a speciesist variation of skepticism. But this position is flawed because, as we saw before, species differences are of degree and not of kind. So it's very weird that sometimes that there are so many differences in understanding between different groups of humans and humans and other animals. It's not either or, it's a spectrum, and there's just a lot of different relationships that determine how and if we understand each other. Furthermore, there's a lot that we do share with many others, and I think that so there's a huge discussion about decoding animal languages with AI, but when we return to the slaughterhouse, to the animals telling us that they do not want to be slaughtered with their body language, with their voices, with whatever they have to say to be able to say it to us, we understand it. We do. So I think that wanting to decode other animals' languages is problematic because it's about our knowledge satisfaction, but it's also problematic because if we refuse to listen, it's not going to benefit them at all. So second point, knowledge of others is not connected to species membership per se. I will move a bit faster for reasons of time. Social relationships also matter. And this is important to think about also when you consider your own life and relationships that you have with non-human animals. It's sometimes worth it to reevaluate them on this basis. Between humans, language can also deceive us, so it's not that spoken language is automatically connected to truth or knowledge. perhaps the most important point, language is not simply in the mind. It's embodied, situated, and can take many forms in different kinds of beings. And what's also important is that this kind of species skepticism is self-perpetuating. So Vinciane Desprez, a Belgian philosopher, wrote a book with the wonderful title, What Would Animals Say If We Asked the Right Questions? And she studied ethologists, so she studied humans who studied the minds of other animals, and shows that their prejudice and bias has determined the knowledge that has been created about other animals in science. So humans who, for example, think that rats are smart will set up studies that show that rats are smart, and humans who think that rats are stupid will create studies that show that rats are stupid. Very often prejudice about non-human animals is intertwined with human prejudice about humans, for example in relation to gender. So Desprez writes a lot about the myth of the alpha male, which is basically the idea that in some societies like wolves or baboons there is this male alpha person on top, and then there's this hierarchy. But these studies were all done in zoos with scarcity created by humans, and studies both with baboons by feminist biologists, and studies of wolves show a completely different picture of the kinds of societies that they form. Furthermore, Desprez also shows that then this idea about gender in non-human animals is translated back into human societies to construct a certain image of what is natural for humans, for example, with regard to gender. Anyway, what is important is that if we, in this context about language, if we approach other animals as beings we can never get to know, this will determine the research questions that we ask, and that will determine the answers that they can give. So what kind of proposals are there in the literature about including non-human animal perspectives in decision making? On the photograph you see Doris. Doris is very happy to be included in decision making. She's not very happy about me being here, but she will be happy that I will go back home. So the first promising strand of taking animal perspectives into account in creating knowledge and creating new forms of living together is what has been termed animal deliberation. Clemens Driessen coined this term, a scholar from Wageningen, and I've also written about this in the past year. The idea is that humans and other animals are already engaged in many practices that resemble dialogues and could be seen as forms of deliberation. So as the philosophers among you might know, deliberation has long been formulated as a practice of humans speaking to other humans using human language and rational argumentation, and then coming to better conclusions. I won't be able to do justice to deliberative theory in the time that I have left, but in the past decades there has been quite a lot of criticism from feminist theory, decolonial theory, arguing that the norms of rational dialogue were in favor of the class in charge, arguing that other forms of interaction should also be seen as part of deliberation. Jane Mansbridge wrote with a couple of colleagues a nice article about proposing a systemic view to deliberation, arguing that our conversations can include all kinds of practices that are maybe not seen as deliberation per se, but that function to shape the whole system of deliberation. And from that perspective, interactions between humans and other animals can also be conceptualized as deliberation, taking into account the fact that dialogues are embodied and situated, that they can involve objects, that they can involve interventions in the landscape, and other material practices. I will skip over multi-species justice theory, but that's another theoretical strand that's taking seriously not simply the interests, but also the expressions and ways of being of non-human others, not just animals, but also others. What is important to mention is that we already see forms of interaction that take seriously non-human animals, not simply as knowers, but also as leaders of the community and co-creators of knowledge in certain animal sanctuaries. For example, in Vine Sanctuary in Vermont, an LGBTQ plus led sanctuary that really sees the non-human inhabitants not as animals to care for, but as co-creators of common communities. And one of the models that I've been working on in the past years is multi-species assemblies, based on the idea of citizens' assemblies, but extended to include the voices of non-human animals and the interests of others, like human children, plants, ecosystems, and others. So this brings me, so there are already proposals for including animal perspectives in decision making, and this leads me to my last point, which regards law, because I think that we see similar approaches to law that sometimes include animal agency and sometimes not, but that do challenge where what law is for, by whom it is formulated, and what kind of function it has in our society. And one of the nice things I learned in this conference from all of you is that the law is actually quite porous. Many of you have shown that yes, there are not binary stories between humans who have it all and other animals who are completely excluded. And there's also already a lot of recognition in different places of how law takes the voices of others seriously. One of the most successful examples is the rights of nature paradigm that a lot of you have discussed, and that's very interesting because it takes seriously non-Western constructions of knowledge. So it's changing who decides what law is and what kind of story we tell each other about law. However, when it comes to non-human animals, they are generally not recognized explicitly. And when you read articles about rights of nature, very often if you search for the word animal in them, it's never, not even mentioned in the text. So both in the theory and in the practice of rights of nature, there should be a lot more attention for other animals as beings who have their own rights to the land and their own opinions on what we should do with it. A second example concerns political animal parties that are trying to get not just animal rights recognized, but also attention for their specific ways of flourishing and their ways of life. And in the Netherlands, we have a party for the animals. They proposed we have a wet dieren in the Netherlands, so a law concerning the animals, and the Party for the Animals proposed an amendment to this law a couple of years back that was actually quite far-reaching, because it stated that all non-human animals should be able to flourish in their species-specific ways. And this amendment was accepted, and then humans began to deliberate about it, and now it's rejected because it was actually too complex. But it's I think a nice example of how very, very radical change can be within reach, except then this didn't happen. It would have been nice if it would have. Another place in which not just the rights, but also the agency of non-human animals and their position of nowhere is recognized is in the recent work from scholars like Gay Bradshaw and John Hadley, Joyce Milburn and others, to view conservation not just as something that, not just as a human practice, but really to connect it to habitat rights and land rights for non-human animals. The idea is that they will take better care of the land than the humans would, and this would obviously change how the legal system works if we take seriously their viewpoint on this. Then perhaps the most important points for this conference, and also for the future, is that in addition to many studies about language, culture, cognition, emotion, and so on, there's a lot of research about species-specific forms of normativity, about how social non-human animals organize their communities. There's a lot of work about democracy in animal communities, for example. African wild dogs sneeze to make group decisions. So when enough members of the group sneeze, they go there. African buffaloes, the women are the ones in charge in that community, and they vote by standing up, lying down in a certain position, and when over 70% of the group lies down in that position, then they move in that position. Sometimes they also split up. Pigeons always vote about where they go, and everybody has a vote, even the lowest ranking members in the community. Bees are another example that you might have heard of. They dance to tell each other where they can find the best place to build their nest, and also use scent and sound. And this can be seen as a form of deliberation. So what can law do with these species-specific forms of normativity, and how can we move to a multi-species law? I think we saw examples of many different kinds of practices, and also during these last 3 days, many examples of how the law is already changing. What I am hoping for is that we conduct more political experiments together with non-human animals, based on consent and freedom, obviously, of all involved. So I'm not saying that we should capture them and then have experiments, and that we can get a better understanding of what law can do for all of us. Because I think that one of the important things is of thinking through concepts with non-human animals is that it's ultimately about justice and fairness for everybody. And in that sense, animals are always also a kind of test case for our ideas. If they are respectful to them, then they are functioning well, I think. So thanks a lot for your attention.